Okay, so is love at first sight real? We've all heard those stories, about people locking eyes across a crowded room and just knowing.
Yeah, like in the movies.
Exactly. But can science actually back up that feeling? That instant connection.
Right.
You guys want to know, and luckily we've got some really interesting research for this deep dive, some personal experiences, even some cultural perspectives to kind of unpack this whole idea.
Yeah, and what's funny to me is we always hear about love at first sight in like fairy tales.
Right.
But then you have these researchers trying to like measure it in a lab.
Really?
Yeah, in one study, they used speed dating to observe couples.
Okay.
And track things like changes in their skin sweat and even like little movements they made.
Hold on. You can measure a love connection with sweat.
Well, they were looking for like synced biological responses.
Okay.
And it turns out the couples who felt a spark, they actually showed these synchronized reactions.
Wow.
Like their bodies were literally on the same wavelength.
So like their bodies were saying, hey, I like what I see here, before their minds even caught up.
Exactly.
But isn't that probably just attraction? Not necessarily love at first sight.
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
We have to be careful about using the word love too quickly.
Right.
I mean, infatuation, that initial rush of excitement, totally real.
Yeah.
But it's different from, deep, enduring love
Right.
that builds over time.
The kind of love that lasts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It makes me think about that story you told me about the time you thought you were in love.
Oh, yeah.
But it turned out to be more about the fireworks than the substance.
Oh, absolutely. Learned that lesson the hard way.
Yeah.
It was all passion and intensity, but it lacked those key ingredients, that make love last.
Right.
Like intimacy and a sense of real commitment.
Exactly. It's like what psychologists talk about with the triangular theory of love. Intimacy, passion, and commitment.
Right.
Love at first sight might nail the passion part.
For sure.
But what about the others? Those usually develop more gradually.
Right. Those other elements take time, shared experiences, really getting to know someone beyond that surface level.
Yeah.
So maybe we're getting a little ahead of ourselves calling it love after just a glance.
Maybe.
But there's no denying that initial spark feels powerful.
Right.
So what is actually happening in our brains when we feel that intense attraction?
Well, when we're attracted to someone, our brains release a flood of dopamine.
Dopamine.
Yeah, that feel-good chemical.
Okay.
It's like our internal reward system is going into overdrive, making us crave more of that feeling.
So our brains are giving us a little chemical high.
Exactly.
No wonder it feels so good.
And to make things even more intense, there's also a surge of oxytocin,
Oxytocin, now what is that?
sometimes called the love hormone,
Oh,
because it plays a role in bonding and attachment.
wow. So there's actually a biological basis for those feelings of connection.
Uh-huh.
But if these chemicals are making us feel so good, how can we tell if it's the start of real love or just a temporary rush?
That's where things get tricky. Those chemical reactions are powerful,
Right.
but they don't necessarily mean you've found the one.
Okay.
It's important to remember that, while those early stages of attraction feel amazing, they're not always a reliable predictor of long-term compatibility.
So basically our brains are wired for attraction, but love is a whole other ballgame.
Yeah,
It's a much deeper and more complex process.
sure.
But here's something I've been thinking about. The idea of love at first sight is so romanticized in our culture.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we see it everywhere, from classic novels to movies.
Totally.
Do you think all that influences our expectations about love?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of love at first sight is like deeply embedded in our cultural narratives.
Yeah.
Like we're constantly bombarded with these stories
Right.
of instant connections and whirlwind romances. It's almost like we're, conditioned to believe that love should happen that way.
And it's not just fiction. It seems like a lot of people actually believe in love at first sight.
Oh, for sure.
I remember seeing this survey, and the majority of both men and women said they believed in it.
Yeah, that's right. It's like
Weird.
we all secretly hope to experience that magical moment,
Yeah.
instant connection.
Of course.
But it's important to remember that real life relationships are usually a lot more complicated than the fairy tales make them seem.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've got the science of attraction, we've got the cultural influence. But what about real life examples? Have you come across any stories about people who experienced love at first sight and actually made it work?
I have. I remember reading this blog post about a couple who described feeling this like incredible connection from the moment they met, and they ended up getting married and were together for decades.
Wow, that's amazing. It gives you hope that maybe those fairy tales aren't so far-fetched after all.
Right.
But I imagine it doesn't always work out that smoothly.
Unfortunately not. There are also plenty of stories where people mistake that initial infatuation for true love.
Right.
And end up getting hurt, for example. I read about this person who fell head over heels for someone they barely knew.
Oh, no.
They rushed into things, but ultimately the relationship fell apart because they hadn't built a real foundation.
Yeah.
Beyond that surface level attraction.
Like you were saying before, intimacy and commitment are just as important as passion.
Totally.
And those things take time and effort to cultivate.
Yeah.
So maybe the lesson here is that even if you experience that initial spark, it's important to be realistic about what it means.
Right.
It could be the start of something amazing,
Yeah.
but it's not a guarantee.
Exactly. I think that's such an important point. That first spark of attraction can be so exciting, but it's really just the first step in a much longer journey.
So if we're thinking about this from the listener's perspective, how can they apply these insights to their own lives?
Well, if you find yourself feeling that intense attraction to someone, it's worth taking a step back and asking yourself some questions, like beyond the initial excitement. Do you see the potential for a real connection? Do you share similar values and goals? Are you both willing to put in the work to build something meaningful?
Those are really great questions to consider. It's like you're saying, don't let the butterflies completely sweep you off your feet.
Right.
Enjoy the excitement, but also use your head and your heart to figure out if this could be something real.
Precisely. It's all about finding that balance between the emotional and the rational. After all, we want love that's both exhilarating and grounded, right?
Absolutely. So after all this, where do we land on the idea of love at first sight? Is it a myth, a reality, or is it somewhere in between?
I mean, it seems like instant attraction is definitely real. We've seen how our brains and bodies just light up when we, encounter someone appealing.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's love right away.
So it's more about the potential for love.
Exactly. That initial spark. It might be the catalyst. But building a lasting, fulfilling love takes so much more.
Like what?
It takes time, shared experiences, deep conversations, vulnerability, the willingness to grow together through challenges.
It's like you said earlier, it's about choosing each other day after day, even when things get tough.
That's right. Those romantic comedies might skip over that part.
Right.
But real love is about building a connection that goes so much deeper than just those initial butterflies.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like we've gone way beyond just the simple question of love at first sight.
Yeah.
And really explored the complexity of attraction, love, and relationships.
And that's what's so great about these deep dives, isn't it? We get to uncover the nuances of these big questions and realize there's always more to learn.
So for you listening, here's something to ponder. The next time you feel that spark, that pull towards someone, what questions are you going to ask yourself? How will you explore whether this could be the beginning of something real and lasting, or just a fleeting moment of intense attraction? Maybe the answer lies in another deep dive. Until then, happy exploring.